Less than 2 weeks ago, Secretary Panetta wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal urging the Congress and the President to make the required budget decisions to protect our economy and our national security. He warned against further reductions in the readiness of our armed forces, noting that the real strength of our nation lies in the brave Americans who are willing to fight and die for this country when called upon to do so. President Truman would have agreed with that advice. For his distinguished service and extensive service, and for the wisdom that he offers us today, the Truman Good Neighbor Award Foundation is proud to present him with the 2014 Harry S. Truman Good Neighbor Award.
Secretary, we're going to want to take a picture of you here.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for this great tribute. I really do want to express my thanks to Carl and the board and all those who recommended this award. I can't tell you how deeply honored I am by it. I also want to take this moment to congratulate Colonel Neer for his great service to this country, and also congratulate all of the students who I had a chance to meet and who are just, true examples of the kind of young people that I think can hold the future in terms of where we go and how good we are, both here and throughout the world. So I'm honored to be here. First of all, Kansas City, chance to be here in the heartland. I had a chance, as Carl mentioned, to serve with a lot of distinguished members from this area. Both Ike Skelton, who was a dear friend and somebody from this area, as well as Dick Gephardt, worked with a number of members of Congress, obviously Kit Bond, Jack Danford, and a number of other representatives that I had. Bill Emerson was my ranking member on the Ag Committee, and we worked very closely together on a lot of food programs. So I have a very warm feeling in my heart for Kansas City and for all the good people that come from this part of the world. And I also want to thank you for supporting our military in this area and for supporting our veterans. You are wonderful patriots in the way that you support our country and the men and women that serve this country. I'm honored also because of the foundation. This foundation does some great work in promoting and preserving an understanding and devotion to the principles that were advocated by President Truman. And among those, obviously, is scholarship and education. Harry Truman had tremendous devotion to the importance of education, and he called it our first line of defense, and it truly is our first line of defense. And he also called it the citadel of human freedom. Education is critical to our democracy. And I'm also honored just because of the great legacy and leadership of President Truman. He was someone, as you all know, who came from humble beginnings. Didn't have a chance to go to college because he had to work, but he read a great deal, read history, read all of Mark Twain, read Dickens, read the Bible a couple times, worked very hard, fought hard, and he was, in the words of Dave McCullough, someone who stood for common sense, who stood for common decency, and who spoke in a common tongue. Harry Truman, in many ways, lived the American dream. In many ways, lived the American dream. Coming from those humble beginnings to be President of the United States. I guess the reason I'm so honored is because in many ways I've had the privilege of living that American dream myself. As was pointed out, I'm the son of Italian immigrants to this country. They came here like millions of other immigrants. Very little money, few skills. Didn't have much language ability at the time, but they wanted to come to this country. My father was the 13th in his family. He had several brothers who had come here before they came. One brother, his oldest brother, Bruno, settled up in Sheridan, Wyoming, and another brother settled in California, Tony. So as was the custom for an Italian family, you visit your older brother first. So they went up to Sheridan and visited Bruno and stayed there for one winter. My mother said, I think it's time to visit your other brother in California. They managed to make it to California, Honoree, California, where I was born. And my dad opened a restaurant during the war years. Honoree was kind of a jumping town at that time. Not only were they catching a lot of sardines off the coast, Cannery Row developed in Honoree, Steinbeck's Cannery Row. But we also had a military post, Fort Ord, which was training men from across the country, training them to go to the battlefields of World War II. And I can remember my parents inviting some of those young men to our house for Christmas and looking at them and knowing that, I was just a kid, looking at them and knowing that they were going to be going to war. And I always remembered that, particularly when I served as Secretary of Defense. And then, my parents worked hard. My earliest recollections were as a young kid standing on a chair washing glasses in the back of that restaurant. My parents believed that child labor was a requirement in my family. And then he sold the restaurant and bought a farm out in Carmel Valley and planted a walnut orchard. And again, it was important for us to keep working out there. We did hoeing, we moved irrigation pipes, and as the walnut trees grew taller, my father would go around with a pole and hook and shake each of the branches. That's how you pick walnuts. Today they put a band around a tree and shake the whole tree. But in those days he was going around with a pole and hook and shaking each of the branches, and my brother and I used to be underneath collecting the walnuts. When I got elected to Congress, my father said, you've been well trained to go to Washington because you've been dodging nuts all your life. My father, I used to ask him, why did he travel all of that distance to come to this country? He had comfort of family, even though it was a poor area in Italy. Why would you do that? My father said the reason was because my mother and he believed that they could give their children a better life in this country. And I think that's the American dream. It's the dream that my wife and I want for our 3 sons, and hopefully what they will want for their children as well. It is the American dream. It's the purpose of what this country is all about, very frankly. But dreams are just dreams unless you're willing to work at it. That was another value that my father taught me. You got to work at it. You got to be willing to sacrifice. You have to roll up your sleeves. You got to be willing to dedicate yourself to getting it done, to fight if necessary, in order to make it happen, to have the grit to be able to make it happen. And it is necessary to do that. I mean, that ability to keep fighting is what our pioneers were about. It's what the immigrants were about. It's what our forefathers was about. It's about what this guy was about. Willingness to keep fighting for what you believe in. I had a Jesuit who taught me at Santa Clara University who said, Leon, life is a struggle. Life is a struggle, and you got to fight in order to be able to survive. Typical Jesuit. And to emphasize the point, he told me the story. He says, I want you to remember the story. There was a rabbi and a priest who decided that they would get to know each other, understand each other's religion, so they would go out to events together. knowing that if they went there, they would talk to each other and really begin to understand each other's faith. So one night they went to a boxing match. And just before the bell rang, one of the boxers made the sign of the cross. The rabbi nudged the priest and he said, "What does that mean?" The priest said, "It doesn't mean a damn thing if he can't fight." Now, ladies and gentlemen, we bless ourselves with the hope that everything's going to be fine in this country, but very frankly, it doesn't mean a damn thing unless we're willing to fight for it. Those are the values that made this the greatest country on earth. And whether or not our leadership is willing to embrace those same values will determine whether we remain the greatest country on earth. As I look at this country, I've served almost 50 years in public life in one way or another. And as I look at where we are, 2014, and I see the kind of gridlock that we see in Washington, I also see this sense of kind of withdrawing from the world, pulling inward. And, you know, it's 2014, it's 100 years since the beginning of World War I. And if you think about that, look at some of the elements that were present in World War I. And I'm not saying that, you know, history repeats itself, but you learn from history. And there are some of the same ingredients out there in the world: terrorism, territorial disputes, alliances, the inability to deal with flashpoints that suddenly popped up. And a lot of those same ingredients are out there. And so when you look at, you know, both what's happening here and abroad, you know, I think this country is facing kind of two paths. I think one path is we could be an America in Renaissance. I think we could be an America that is on the cusp of a strong economic recovery. The fundamentals of our economy are good. Wherever I go in this country, the fundamentals are good. Tremendous creativity, tremendous innovation. I think we can teach people the skills they need for the challenges of the 21st century. I think we can improve the education of our young people so that they have those skills. I think we can provide opportunity. I think we can develop energy independence. I think we can improve trade relations. I think we could discipline our budget. I think we can have a leaner defense, but one that's agile and still the strongest on the face of the earth, supporting, hopefully, a strong diplomacy and world leadership in a very troubled world. I think we can have that kind of America. But we could also be an America in decline, facing crisis after crisis, politically dysfunctional, unable to deal with the challenges facing our country, our freedoms, our economy, our national security. What path we take will largely be determined by how we govern ourselves or how we fail to govern ourselves. I often tell the students at the Institute for Public Policy that my wife and I established in Honoree, I tell them that in a democracy we govern either by leadership or by crisis. If leadership is there and willing to take the risks associated with leadership, then we can avoid crisis and certainly control crisis. But if leadership is not there, then we will govern by crisis. And unfortunately today, too often we govern by crisis after crisis after crisis. You can do that. You can do that. Somehow survive in office by doing that. But there's a price to be paid. And the price is that we lose the trust of the American people in our system of governing. And trust, very frankly, is critical to a democracy. Harry Truman once said that men make history and not the other way around. In periods where there is no leadership, society stands still. Progress occurs when courageous and skillful leaders seize the opportunity to change things for the better. In the 50 years that I've been involved in public life, I've seen Washington at its best and Washington at its worst. I've seen Washington work. That's the good news. When I first went back to work for a senator from California, Tom Kuechel, there were others very similar to him. Some of these names maybe you'll recognize. Jacob Javits from New York, George Aiken from Vermont, Hugh Scott from Pennsylvania, Cliff Case from New Jersey, Mark Hatfield from Oregon, and others. And they were working with distinguished Democrats at the time. Hubert Humphrey, Henry Jackson from Washington, Warren Magnuson, Sam Ervin, Dick Russell, William Fulbright, Symington. These were all individuals. Yes, they had their political differences. Yes, they fought each other in elections. But when it came to national issues, they worked together. Everett Dirksen, minority leader, worked with Lyndon Johnson. That's why we were able to pass civil rights legislation. That's why we were able to pass landmark legislation in a number of areas, because the parties were willing to work together to be able to get that done. When I was elected, it was very much the same. Tip O'Neill, who was Speaker, worked very closely with Bob Michel, who was the minority leader. Whether it was a Republican president or a Democratic president, if they felt it was important for the country, they worked together. They believed that governing was not only good for the country, it happened to be good politics as well. Today, I'm concerned because I've never seen Washington in as much gridlock as it is today. And it's caused by a number of reasons. Part of it is small margin of power that drives each party to try to achieve power and makes the parties much more partisan. It's caused by members that kind of have to move to the extremes in order to protect themselves. Republicans worried about competition from the right, Democrats worried about it from the left, so they move to the extremes rather than to the center, where you need to be if you're going to find consensus. There's a hell of a lot of money in politics now. Most of it basically inspires the parties not to get anything done. And media is more interested in sound bites than in the parties working together. So, those are a lot of reasons why we see the divisions that take place. And, look, the reality is that both parties bear some blame here, both Democrats and the Republicans, both the president and the Congress. What I'm concerned about is that when they face barriers, and it's tough there in Washington these days, it is tough. I understand that, having just come out of there. But you can't give up. You can't give up. You got to keep fighting. And my sense is that in many ways they've kind of given up on achieving the kind of deficit reduction deal that we should have for a country that has a record debt, one that's going to be 80% of GDP by the 2020s, and it's going to create a fiscal crisis for this country. They've kind of given up on that. They've given up on developing any kind of approach to immigration reform, which needs to be done in order to produce a fairer and more effective system. They've given up on infrastructure. 30% of our bridges are near collapse. 35% of our highways need repair. We've got to support a strong infrastructure for a strong country. They've given up on that. They've given up on trade. They've given up on energy issues. I think it was Teddy Roosevelt who said, when you're faced with a tough decision, the best thing you can do is to make the right decision. The next best thing you can do is to make the wrong decision. The worst thing you can do is to do nothing. And too often, nothing is being accomplished. I I believe, even as tough as it is now, I believe in leadership. Governing's not easy. My God, governing is not easy. You have to deal with people that you may not like. It's cross-section from this country. Some are smart, some are dumb, some are honest, some are not honest. I mean, you know, Truman said when he first came to Washington, for the first 6 months he was trying to figure out how the hell he got there. And then for the next 6 months he was trying to figure out how the hell everybody else got there. So it's not easy. It's not easy. Governing is not easy. It's a tough challenge. And yet, it is what you have to do in order to make sure our democracy works. And frankly, we have done that. We've faced crisis in this country. We've faced wars. We've faced recessions, depressions, natural disasters, and ultimately, the right leadership comes to the fore. And I believe it will again. Why? Because the real strength of America, very frankly, doesn't lie in Washington. It lies in the common sense and resilience and grit and fight of the American people. I've seen those values in the men and women that serve this country in uniform, that are willing to fight and to die for the United States of America, that are willing to put their lives on the line for this country. I saw it in the SEALs that conducted the operation against bin Laden, having to go 150 miles into Pakistan at night, not knowing what the hell they were going to find or what the risks that could have exploded on them at that moment. But they did the mission, and they were successful, and they sent a clear message to the world that nobody attacks the United States of America and gets away with it. They were brave enough to do that. And frankly, because of the sacrifices of our men and women in uniform, we are a country that is safe today because they're willing to do that. And we have to remain safe. We have to remain strong. There's a hell of a lot of threats in this world. I've never seen a world dealing with as many flashpoints as we have today. We're still a country at war. We're still facing a threat from terrorism. Yes, we've gone after core al-Qaeda leadership, but al-Qaeda now is on the rise in Yemen, in Syria, in Somalia, throughout North Africa, with the threat that they could attack this country. We see the problems in North Korea and the unpredictability of a country that has a nuclear capability. We see Iran with the ability to provide enriched uranium for the potential weapon. We hope these negotiations work out, but it remains a threat. We've seen what happens in the Middle East. We've seen Syria become a humanitarian disaster. We're now dealing with Russia and their aggressive efforts in the Ukraine. We're dealing with China. Even though we have strong economic relations with China, they're making territorial claims in the South China Sea. We're dealing with, frankly, a whole new threat that's out there called cyber attacks. And let me just tell you, cyber attacks could very well paralyze this nation. That's the reality we're dealing with. You don't have to send a B-2 bomber. You don't have to send an F-16. You can just stay at a computer and insert a worm into a system and paralyze a country. I mean, our enemies are looking at our electric grid systems, our chemical systems. They're looking at our transportation systems. And they could literally create a Pearl Harbor using a cyber attack. So those are the threats that we face at a time when there's a lot of questions about our ability to provide strong leadership, to stand by our word, to have the resources we need for a strong defense, the resources to invest in our country, and a political system that isn't willing to work together. As I said, I truly believe in American leadership. I want it to lead. I want it to fight. But if change doesn't happen from the top down, mark my words, it will happen from the bottom up. And that's why these young people are so important. That's why our men and women are so important. Because I truly believe that they understand what it takes in order to be able to make our country great. Let me conclude with a plaque that I saw in Afghanistan, one of the bases that I went to. And on the wall was a saying from Isaiah, chapter 6, verse 8 of Isaiah. This was on the wall. And then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, "Whom shall I send? Who will go for us?" And then I said, "Here I am, Lord, send me." In Hebrew, it's hineni, send me. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the sound of the trumpet that I think must call all of us to action in our democracy. It's a call that Harry Truman responded to as President of the United States. And surely if the men and women in uniform are willing to put their lives on the line, fight and die for this country, it's not too much to ask our elected leadership to have just a small amount of that same courage in order to govern this country. All of us are the ones that are going to have to press for that. That's what a democracy is all about. The power lies in this room. The power lies in the American people. And if we fight for what we believe is right, then I think we can have an American Renaissance. We can have the American dream fulfilled for our children. And we can protect a government of, by, and for all people. But it doesn't mean a damn thing unless we're willing to fight for it. God bless you. Thank you for this honor, and God bless our country.